Montana Territory, 1883. Snow still clung to the earth in patches, stubborn and gray, when Francesca Nolan stepped off the back of a rickety freight wagon outside the town of Red Bluff. Her arms trembled from holding her baby too tight, and her boots sank a little into the mud as she turned toward the saloon doors, eyes scanning faces that didn't look back. Her baby whimpered against her chest, wrapped in a worn quilt. She hushed him softly, pressing her lips to his downy head. She had nowhere else to go. A month ago, she had been a wife. A week ago, a widow. Now, she was just a mother trying to keep her son from being taken. Her husband had died under a collapsed beam in the Helena silver mine, leaving nothing but debt. The mining company said she owed for his tools, for his bunk, even for the boots he died in. And since she could not pay, a man from the company had come with a county deputy to say the law would place her son with someone who could a proper family. She had run that night, stealing into the snowy dark with nothing but her baby, a change of clothes, and the last of her husband's wages, a few silver coins sewn into her hem. She had no plan, not until she saw him. He stood near the smithy, tall and broad-shouldered, hat low over his brow. Dust clung to his worn brown duster, and a rifle hung across his saddle. One stirrup boot rested on a water barrel, and he watched the street like someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised by anything anymore. Francesca did not know why she walked straight toward him. Maybe it was the calm in his eyes. Maybe it was the way her knees felt like they might give if she kept standing alone. "Please," she said, her voice raw, holding her baby tighter. "Do not let them take him. Please." He looked at her then. Really looked. His eyes were the kind that saw the whole story without asking a single question. "I will take care of you both," he said. Francesca's breath broke as something inside her cracked wide open, relief or fear. She could not tell. She nodded, even as tears stung her eyes. "Come on," he said, jerking his chin toward the end of the dusty street. "You can rest up at my place." He did not ask questions, did not press her for details. His name was Zachary Jameson. Folks around town called him Zach. He had a small cabin 2 miles out, past a stand of pine and cottonwood, with a corral and a half-built barn. He had no wife, no children, only a quiet horse and a scar under his left eye that looked older than the war. The cabin was warm from the fire he kept going. Francesca sat down slowly on the rocking chair he offered, rocking her baby Samuel gently, while Zach brewed coffee and stirred stew over the hearth. "You got anyone looking for you?" he asked, not unkind. She hesitated. "Maybe. A man from the mining company. He said the courts would rule me unfit." She looked down. "I left before they could." Zach nodded once, like he had heard worse. "You are not unfit," he said. Francesca looked up. "You do not even know me. Do not need to." He passed her a mug. "You are still here. That says everything." The next few days passed like a strange dream. Zach gave her space, but never made her feel unwelcome. He helped her carry water, chopped extra wood, even built a cradle from old timber he had lying behind the barn. She washed his shirts and hung them in the sun. She fed the hens. She kissed Samuel's soft head and watched him sleep in the cradle Zach carved with his own hands. And every evening, they sat side by side on the porch, watching the light fade off the hills. "You are good with him," Francesca said once, nodding toward Samuel, who cooed in Zach's lap. Zach looked down, lips twitching in what might have been a smile. "I had a younger brother. He did not make it past his 3rd year. I guess I never forgot how small they are." Francesca looked at him, really looked. The scar, the quiet strength, the way he held her son like something precious. Something warm stirred in her chest. But safety never stayed long. It was 4 days later when Zach's horse returned without him. Francesca saw the riderless mare limping into the yard at sunset, saddle empty, reins dragging, foam on her flanks. Her breath caught. Samuel stirred in the sling against her chest. She ran. She followed the trail into the woods, heart pounding, branches slapping her face. She found Zach slumped against a tree, blood on his shoulder, his rifle beside him. "Zach," she cried, falling to her knees. He blinked up at her, dazed. "He followed me. From town. Tried to drag me in for harboring you. Said you were a fugitive." Her hands trembled as she tore open his coat. The bullet had grazed his shoulder, bleeding hot and fast. "Stay awake," she said, pressing her scarf to the wound. "You are not dying." Not now. Not after everything. He grunted, trying to sit up. He ran off. But he will be back. Then we will not be here when he comes. She used all her strength to get him on his feet, half carrying him back through the trees. It took hours, the moon rising full and cold through the pines. Back at the cabin, she stitched his shoulder with shaking fingers and boiled water for fever. She did not sleep. Not once. By morning, his fever broke. He opened his eyes to find her asleep beside the bed, her hand resting on his. I meant it, he said softly, voice rough. I will take care of you both. She blinked awake, eyes red. You nearly died. But I did not. He reached for her hand. You could leave, he said. Still time. But if you stay, I want it to be for more than safety. Francesca looked into his eyes. There was no fear there. No promises he could not keep. Just a man who had chosen her. And her son. I am not leaving, she whispered. Not ever. He pulled her gently toward him, and this time, when she pressed her lips to his, it was not out of fear. It was out of something that had been growing quietly since the moment he looked at her and said those words. I will take care of you both. And she believed him. The snow melted for good by the second week of April, and the wind carried the scent of pine sap and wet earth. Francesca moved through the days with sleeves rolled and hair tied back, her hands red from scrubbing and chopping, her shoulders aching each evening in a way that made her feel alive. Zach's shoulder healed slower than he liked. He carried the stiffness in silence, but winced when he reached too far, and she noticed every time. She didn't speak of it, just shifted her weight, passed him what he needed before he had to ask, or quietly took over when he tried to lift more than he should. One morning, he sat sharpening a draw knife on the porch while she knelt in the garden bed, coaxing life from the soil with a trowel dulled from years of use. The sun was warm against the back of her neck, and Samuel napped in a basket under the eaves, his tiny chest rising and falling in soft rhythm. What's that you're planting? Zach asked, his voice low and even. Beets, mostly. Some carrots, she said, brushing dirt from her wrist. I had a patch once, back near Butte. Never got much from it, but I liked the tending. You ever have chickens there? No. Just a goat that didn't like me and a neighbor who did. He grunted softly, dragging the blade slow across the whetstone. That neighbor ever caused trouble? He tried to kiss me once. I broke his nose with a broom handle. He paused, looking down at the blade, then nodded. Good. She smiled at the soil, not the blade. Later that day, she found a tin of seeds tucked inside the pantry: radish, squash, and a frayed envelope labeled sweet corn in pencil. The handwriting was not Zach's. She turned it over once, then returned them to the shelf without asking. That night, as the fire burned low and Samuel stirred in his sleep, she sat at the table, mending a tear in one of Zach's shirts. He moved around the cabin slow and steady, checking the locks, placing another log on the fire with a grunt. I never thanked you, she said. He looked at her, brow slightly drawn. For what you did that night, she said. You could have stayed out of it. Let them take me. But you didn't. He leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. I don't reckon I could have watched something like that and slept sound. You didn't know me. His gaze didn't waver. Didn't need to. Francesca set the needle down. What made you say it? He tilted his head. That day in town, she continued, when I asked you not to let them take him. You said you'd take care of us both. You didn't hesitate. What? Zach stepped forward slowly, silent until the stool creaked under him. I had a sister once, he said. Younger. She married a man who drank mean. I was away working cattle when he broke her arm. By the time I got back, she was gone. No one knows where. I always figured, if I saw it again, I'd do different. Francesca looked down at the shirt in her lap. I'm sorry. He shook his head once. You don't need to say that. She reached across the table, her fingertips brushing his. You didn't fail her. I never got the chance to prove I wouldn't. They sat in silence. The fire crackled softly. I want to stay here, she said at last. You already are. No, she said, meeting his eyes. I mean, not just for safety. I want to make something of this place. For Samuel. For you, if you'll have me. Zach didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the trees. I wasn't sure what you'd want once you got your legs under you again, he said. Didn't want to push. You haven't. He turned back, eyes steady. Then yes, I want that too. The next morning, She found a folded piece of paper on the table beside her coffee. Her name written in blocky, careful letters. Inside was a drawing rough but thoughtful of a small house with smoke curling from the chimney, a fence around a garden, and a cradle under the open window. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up. Zach was by the barn, hammering new planks onto the half-raised frame. When he glanced back at the cabin, she lifted the paper and held it against her heart. He tipped his hat, then got back to work. By late May, the barn stood finished, rough-hewn but sturdy, its walls squared and roof tight against the mountain wind. Zach ran his hand along the edge of the doorframe one evening, thumb brushing a knot in the grain where he'd left a mark by accident. He didn't sand it out. Some things, he figured, were meant to stay visible. Francesca had taken to the rhythm of the place like she'd always been part of it. She knew which hens laid in the morning and which waited till dusk. She'd figured out which creek stones kept the kettle steady over the fire and how to hush the boards in the floor when Samuel slept. Her presence didn't change the quiet, it deepened it, made it warmer. That evening, the sky hung low and pink over the pines, and the sound of frogs drifted from the marshy corner past the line of cottonwoods. Francesca stood near the barn door, her sleeves damp, a strip of linen tied back around her hair. Samuel was on her hip, one hand curled in her collar. She watched Zach finish stacking the last of the hay bales, her eyes steady. "You ever think about what it was you wanted before all this?" she asked. Zach didn't stop working, but his jaw tightened just enough to answer something before his voice did. "I wanted a stretch of land and quiet enough to hear myself think." That part held true. She shifted Samuel to her other side, rocking slightly to keep him calm. "I wanted to teach. Back in Missouri, I nearly started at a schoolhouse, but I married instead. I don't regret it. But I wonder sometimes if I gave up a piece of myself too early." Zach tossed the last bale onto the loft ledge, then turned to face her fully. "You didn't give anything up. You chose what you needed then. You're choosing different now." She nodded slowly, more to herself than to him. "I want to carve out something steady, not just survive it. I want Samuel to grow up knowing we built this, not that we were just given it." Zach wiped his hands on a rag, then stepped beside her, looking past the barn toward the open pasture. "We could fence that far and near the ridge. Turn some of it for oats. If we're to feed more than chickens, we'll need it." She looked up at him, a flicker of surprise softening her brow. "You're thinking ahead." "I've been thinking ahead since the day you showed up at the edge of town." Her breath caught, just for a second. "I didn't know what I was walking into," she said. "Only that I had to keep going. You walked into a place that needed you more than it knew." That night, after Samuel was down and the lantern burned low, Francesca pulled a folded cloth from the trunk at the foot of the bed. She laid it on the table and opened it carefully, revealing a thin stack of papers, ink faded but legible. Zach watched from the hearth, polishing the barrel of his rifle. "I brought these from Missouri. Lessons I wrote out, for the schoolhouse I never got to. Letters, too, from my father. He wanted more from me than I ever admitted." Zach set the rifle aside. "What are you thinking?" "I'd like to start a gathering. Just once a week. For the children out here. Reading, arithmetic. Maybe scripture if their folks ask for it." He studied her face, then the stack of pages. "You'd be good at that." "I want to be." He walked over and set a hand on her shoulder. "Then we find a way." She turned to him, her voice quieter. "You keep making room for me, even when I don't ask. I see what you're building. I want to be part of it." They stood close, breath mingling in the hush between them. She looked at his mouth, then back at his eyes. "I'm not afraid anymore," she said. "Good," he answered, and kissed her like it was the first thing that had ever made sense. In the weeks that followed, she began gathering the neighbor children under the open lean to behind the cabin. They sat on benches Zach built from pine boards, their feet dangling, eyes wide as she taught them letters and numbers with chalk she'd bartered from the mercantile. Word spread among the homesteads. By midsummer, she had a dozen young ones, their hands stained with charcoal, their voices bright with new words. Zach watched from the fence line one afternoon, reins in hand, as she knelt beside a girl struggling with her sums. Francesca's voice was patient but firm, her smile quiet and sure. "Pa," the girl asked as her father rode up to fetch her. "Can we come again next week?" The man tipped his hat to Francesca, then to Zach. "If she'll have us." "She will," Zach answered, his voice low but certain. She's building something worth staying for. That night, with Samuel asleep between them and the wind soft through the shutters, Zach turned to Francesca beneath the quilt. You still thinking of going back east someday? Her fingers found his. No. This is where I stopped running. He lifted her hand to his chest. Then this is where we stay. By the time the first frost touched the wheatgrass near the ridge, Francesca had sewn Samuel a winter coat from the wool Zach traded for a cord of seasoned pine. The sleeves were too long, but she folded them neat at the cuffs, and he toddled through the yard with his arms sticking straight out, laughter bubbling like spring water. Zach leaned against the corral rail, watching with a kind of quiet he reserved for her and the boy alone. His shoulders still stiffened some in the mornings, but he didn't favor it anymore. When he smiled now, it reached the corners of his eyes. That afternoon, a wagon rolled slow up the path, the horses muddy from the long road, and the man driving them wrapped in a tobacco-colored coat that hung past his knees. He lifted a hand in greeting, but his face was unreadable under the brim of his hat. Francesca stepped forward, Samuel on her hip. Zach met the man halfway down the lane. I'm looking for a Miss Francesca Nolan, the man said. Name's Merritt. I work for Judge Holcomb out of Virginia City. Zach didn't move. She's here. Merritt nodded once. Judge sent me to deliver this. He reached inside his coat and handed over a folded document sealed with wax. It's official. Petition to drop all remaining claims from the Helena mine. Judge signed it himself. Your name's cleared. Francesca took the paper with a slow breath. I didn't expect this. I reckon you earned it, ma'am, Merritt said. Wasn't easy, but someone wrote the judge direct. Explained everything. Sent a witness statement, too, from a man named Langley. Said he saw what happened that night. Said the deputy overstepped. She looked at Zach. He kept his eyes on the horizon. Langley was the farrier's cousin. He saw the scuffle. I just gave him a reason to speak. Merritt tipped his hat. No charge to you, ma'am. Just thought you ought to know. You're free to stay. No court'll come after you now. Francesca's legs felt unsteady. Thank you. After the wagon rolled away, she stood for a long time with the paper held close to her chest. Zach walked over, his boots crunching frost. You should have told me, she said softly. Didn't want you worrying, it wouldn't work. She looked at him, the first breath in her lungs finally full. It did. That night, after Samuel was asleep, she pulled the oil lamp closer on the table and opened the paper again, reading the lines slowly. Zach sat across from her, sharpening an awl with careful strokes. Do you ever think about getting married? She asked, her voice calm. He looked up once, then set the awl down. I've thought about a lot of things since you came here. She folded the paper. You never said. I didn't want to speak it before it was time. She pushed the document aside. What if it is now? Zach stood, the firelight casting a gold line across his jaw. Then I'd say yes. She stood too, slowly. Not just for appearance's sake. Not just because it's easier this way. No, he said. Because I want to be your husband. Because I want to raise Samuel like he's my own. Because this place feels like more than land now. Francesca stepped forward, her hand at his chest. Then ask me. He took her hand in both of his, rough and warm. Will you be my wife, Francesca Nolan? She nodded, voice caught in her throat. Yes. They married 2 Sundays later. The ceremony was small, just 3 families from nearby, and the preacher who rode up from Willow Bend with a broken spur and a good voice for hymns. Francesca wore a dress she let out herself, the hem brushed with pine needles from the walk. Zach wore the same coat he'd worn the day he promised to take care of them. It fit better now. Samuel stood between them, holding his mother's hand with one and Zach's with the other. When the preacher spoke the final words, Zach didn't kiss her with ceremony. He touched her face like he'd been waiting to do it right, then pressed his lips to hers with nothing rushed, nothing borrowed. Just the truth between them. Later, when the guests had gone and the dishes were stacked, Zach lifted Samuel onto his shoulders and walked the fence line while the stars came out. Francesca watched from the porch, one hand resting on her belly. She hadn't told him yet. Not because she was unsure, but because there was something good about letting the peace settle fully between them before speaking what her heart already knew. There would be time. With Zach, there would always be time. The first snowfall came quietly under a pale morning sky, blanketing the pasture in soft silence. Francesca stepped outside with a shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, the cold brushing her cheeks pink. She paused on the porch, watching flakes settle on the fence rails, the barn roof, the path where Zach's boot prints had just begun to fill. Inside, Samuel played with a carved horse on the rug near the stove, his legs crossed beneath him, humming tunelessly. Francesca kept the kettle on a low boil, and a pot of venison stew sent warmth through the cabin's walls. Zach returned from the woods at mid-morning, his coat dusted white and his cheeks ruddy from the chill. He carried a bundle of kindling under one arm and a pair of snares in the other. 2 rabbits, he said, setting the bundle down just inside the door. 1 young, 1 lean. We'll stew them tomorrow. She reached out and brushed snow from his collar. I'll take the pelts. Might stretch them for mittens. He nodded, pulling off his gloves. You sure you're not doing too much? I'm sure. Just need to keep moving. It helps. Zach bent down to unlace his boots. You sleep any better last night? She hesitated, then gave a small shrug. Some. The little one's active already. Mostly at night. That drew a look from him, slow and full of thought. He stood and drew her close, careful of the swell at her middle. I've been thinking, he said, about that far corner of the barn, the one we never finished flooring. I was considering sealing it off, making a space. Crib, maybe a cot. Her arms looped behind his back. It's a good idea. We'll be ready this time. They stood that way for a while, the fire crackling low behind them, the scent of pine smoke curling through the air. Later that week, Zach rode into town to trade for salt pork and flour. He returned with the supplies, and a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Francesca untied it on the table inside, a small stack of muslin, 2 spools of thread, and a length of blue ribbon. I thought you might want to make something new, he said. For the baby. Her fingers ran over the fabric. You picked well. I figured you'd know what to do with it. I do. Through the winter, she sewed in the evenings while Zach repaired the sled runners and carved a new spoon for Samuel. The boy had taken to trailing after Zach during chores, mimicking his movements with a stick over his shoulder, a scrap of rope looped through his belt. One morning in January, Francesca woke before dawn with a dull ache low in her back. She lay still, listening to the wind against the shutters, then nudged Zach's shoulder. It's time. He was up in a breath, hands sure but calm. He built the fire, fetched water, boiled linens. Samuel stayed with the McRaes, their nearest neighbors, fetched the night before just in case. The labor was slow but steady. Francesca bore it without fear, her breath even, her grip firm in Zach's hand when the pain crested. He stayed beside her through every hour, his voice low and steady, wiping her brow, whispering when she needed it most. By dusk, the cabin filled with a new sound, small, strong, and alive. Zach wrapped their daughter in the blue ribbon blanket Francesca had sewn and laid her gently in her mother's arms. Francesca's face was pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright. She looks like you, she whispered. Zach knelt beside the bed, one hand resting lightly against her arm. She's got your eyes. They named her Anna. The first months passed in quiet rhythm. Francesca, nursed by lantern light, sang softly while rocking, and watched the snow melt from the roof one drip at a time. Zach kept close to the cabin, tending only what needed tending. Samuel returned from the McRaes with stories of feeding pigs and sleeping under a quilt stitched with stars. He took to Anna with a quiet pride, laying his carved horse beside her cradle and sitting nearby while Francesca read from the Bible or her stack of lesson papers. The children from the valley came less often in the deepest part of winter, but she kept planning, drawing out lessons for spring. By April, the path to town had dried enough for the wagon. Zach hitched the team while Francesca packed a basket with bread and smoked ham. The family rode in together, wrapped in shawls and coats, Samuel between them and Anna swaddled in Francesca's arms. They stopped at the mercantile, where Mrs. Dalton clucked over the baby and pressed a jar of preserves into Francesca's hands. At the post office, a letter waited from a cousin back in Missouri, asking after her well-being and offering congratulations. Zach held Anna while Francesca read the letter aloud by the wagon, sunlight on her face. You want to write her back? He asked. She folded the letter carefully. Yes. I want her to know I'm home. They returned before dusk, the sky streaked with coral and gold. That night, Francesca tucked Samuel into bed with a story of a fox who outwitted a hunter, while Zach rocked Anna gently by the hearth. When the house quieted, Francesca joined him near the fire. She leaned into his side, head resting against his shoulder. I never expected this, she said. This. Peace. A family. All of it. He kissed the top of her head. Neither did I. She laced her fingers with his. I'm glad we were wrong. Outside, the wind had gone still. The stars blinked out one by one above the ridge, and the cabin stood warm behind shuttered windows, a glow of light and laughter held deep in its bones. There was nothing left unsettled between them. No debts unpaid, no words unsaid. Only the quiet certainty of a life made whole by hand and heart. They stayed together through the seasons, raising their children with steady love and shared labor. Samuel grew tall and sure-footed, Anna bright and curious. Francesca taught at the schoolhouse Zach helped raise with the valley men, and Zach worked the land with the same care he gave to the people he loved. And every evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, they found each other again beside the fire, fingers twined, hearts steady, knowing they had already walked through the hardest part and come home.